My name is Alex Thompson. I am 47 years old, and for 20 of those years, I worked for the United States Forest Service, mostly out of the Lolo and Kootenai National Forests here in Montana. I'm not a scientist or a biologist. I was a wilderness ranger, then a crew boss for trail maintenance. My job was the woods. I knew their sounds, their smells, their rhythms. I knew a bear track from a wolf track from 100 feet away. I knew the difference between a cougar kill and a wolf kill just by looking at the carcass. I thought I knew everything there was to know about the deep woods. I was wrong. I'm telling this story because the official report is a lie, and because my friends, Brian and Corey, deserve more than to be a footnote in a file about a supposed bear attack. The story starts, as these things so often do, with a plan that sounded perfect. It was early October, a few years back.
The larches were turning that brilliant gold, and the air had that clean, sharp bite of coming winter. I have a small rustic cabin that my grandfather built. It's deep in the mountains, miles up a gravel road that's barely maintained. It's my sanctuary. That year, I invited my 3 closest friends up for a final weekend before the snows made the road impassable. Cal, Corey, and Brian. Cal was my oldest friend, a contractor, steady and capable. Corey was ex-Army, did a couple of tours, and was the most level-headed man I knew in a crisis. And Brian was the joker, a software guy from the city who loved the idea of the wilderness more than the reality of it. He was great company, but his carelessness was a constant, low-grade worry. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, the bed of my pickup loaded with coolers of beer, food, and our gear. The drive itself was part of the ritual. The pavement ends, then the graded gravel, and finally the 2-track path that winds through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The cabin isn't much to look at. It's one big room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 4 bunks. No electricity, no running water besides a hand pump outside connected to a well. It's primitive, but it's solid. My grandfather built it with hand-hewn logs, and it has stood for 70 years. We unpacked, got a fire roaring in the hearth, and cracked open the first beers of the weekend. The mood was light, full of the easy camaraderie of men who had known each other for years. We were miles from anyone, surrounded by silence, and it felt like coming home. The first day, Saturday, was perfect. We woke up to a crisp, clear morning. We spent the day fishing the creek that ran about a 1/4 mile from the cabin. We didn't catch much, but that was never the point. We talked, we laughed at Brian's attempts to cast without snagging a tree. We just existed in that peaceful space. As evening approached, we headed back to the cabin. Corey, ever the pragmatist, was already splitting wood for the night's fire. Cal was getting the steaks ready to grill over the open fire pit outside. I was just sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks, feeling a sense of peace that I can't even imagine anymore. That's when I noticed the first thing that was wrong. It was the silence. Not the usual quiet of the woods, but a deep, profound stillness. The normal evening chorus of birds had vanished. The squirrels that were usually chattering and chasing each other through the pines were gone. Even the insects seemed to have ceased their humming. The forest was holding its breath. I mentioned it to Cal. He'd noticed it too. He paused, looking out into the darkening trees. "Weird," he said. "Maybe a predator moving through.
A big cat or a bear waking up for a final meal before hibernating." That made sense. It was a logical explanation, and we accepted it. Brian, of course, overheard us. "It's Bigfoot, guys," he said with a grin. "He's finally come for me. He knows I have the good beer." We told him to shut up and help with the fire, but the silence persisted. It was a heavy, watchful silence that felt entirely different from the peace I'd felt just an hour earlier. We ate dinner around the fire pit, the flames pushing back the encroaching dark. The talk was more subdued than the night before. The unnatural quiet of the woods was getting to all of us, even if only subconsciously. Corey, who had spent countless nights on watch in hostile territory, was noticeably more alert. His eyes kept scanning the perimeter of the firelight, his head cocked as if listening for something he couldn't quite hear. Brian tried to keep the mood light with bad jokes, but they fell flat.
The feeling of being watched was palpable. It was like the air itself had grown thicker. We cleaned up and decided to turn in early, blaming the mountain air for our fatigue. We secured the cabin door, a heavy plank affair with a thick deadbolt and a crossbar, and doused the campfire. The last thing I remember before we went inside was looking up at the sky, a brilliant spray of stars undimmed by city lights, and feeling a prickle of unease on the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the cold. The next morning, the world seemed to have reset. The birds were back, the squirrels were chattering, the oppressive silence was gone. We laughed about how spooked we'd gotten. "Must have been a bear," Corey said, sipping his coffee. "A big one, to shut the woods down like that." We decided to go for a hike, to follow the creek further up the mountain than we usually did. We packed light, water, some snacks, and I brought my .44 Magnum out of habit. Corey had a 6-hour P226, which he almost never went anywhere without. It felt like overkill, but after the previous night, it also felt prudent. We walked for about 2 hours, following the winding path of the creek. The terrain got rougher, the forest thicker. It was beautiful, untamed country. We were in a narrow valley with steep, wooded slopes rising on either side. That's when Cal, who was in the lead, stopped dead. He held up a hand for silence and pointed at the muddy bank of the creek. There, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a track. It was enormous. I've seen thousands of bear tracks in my life. This was not a bear track. A bear track is flat, with 5 distinct toe pads and claw marks. This was long, almost like a massive human foot, but the proportions were all wrong. It had a clear heel, an arch, and 5 digits, but they ended in impressions that looked like claws, not nails. And it was huge, easily 16 inches long. We all gathered around it. I knelt down, my Forest Service training kicking in. I examined the edges. It was fresh, probably from the night before. The sheer depth of it suggested an incredible weight. Brian let out a low whistle. "Okay, that's not a bear," he said, his joking tone gone. "What the hell is that?" I looked around and found another, and then another. They were moving parallel to the creek. The stride was what really got me. I measured it with my steps. The distance between each print was a good 7 feet. For a bipedal gait, that was immense. It meant whatever made it was not only heavy, but also incredibly tall, with a leg span that was hard to comprehend. Corey was crouched next to me, his face grim. "Look at the toes," he said, his voice low. "They're canine, like a wolf's foot, but it's walking on the whole foot like a man." He was right. The shape was a bizarre hybrid of a wolf's paw and a human foot. It was fundamentally, biologically, wrong. We were all silent for a long time, just staring at these impossible tracks. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation. A hoax? Who would come this deep into the wilderness to press fake tracks into a creek bed? A deformed animal? I'd never heard of a deformity that could produce something like this. Every logical explanation I came up with felt thin and insufficient. "We should go back," Cal said, his voice tight. No one argued.
The hike back was silent. The beauty of the forest was gone, replaced by a sense of menace. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig made us jump. We were 4 capable men, 2 of us armed, and we were spooked, deeply spooked. When we got back to the cabin, the sun was high in the sky, but it offered no comfort. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. We had tangible proof that something was out there. Something big, something unknown, and something that walked like a man but had the feet of a monster.
We spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the cabin. It felt foolish, but it was the only thing we could do to feel some semblance of control. We checked the heavy shutters on the windows, making sure the iron bolts were solid. We brought in a large pile of firewood, enough to keep the hearth blazing all night. We discussed our options. We could pack up and leave, but that would mean driving down that winding gravel road in the dark, a prospect none of us relished. The consensus was to stay, to barricade ourselves in the cabin and leave first thing in the morning. We had 2 firearms, solid walls, and each other. We convinced ourselves we would be safe. As dusk fell, the silence returned. It was even more profound this time. It was as if the entire mountain was listening. We ate a cold meal inside, not daring to light an outdoor fire. The mood was grim. Brian tried to make a joke about us being in a horror movie, but it came out as a choked whisper. We sat around the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls.
Corey had cleaned and loaded his pistol, and it lay on the table next to him. I had my .44 on my hip. Every creak of the old cabin made us all freeze. The first sound from outside came around 10 o'clock. It was a heavy, deliberate footstep on the wooden porch. It wasn't the shuffling gait of a bear. It was the solid thump, thump, thump of something with 2 legs. We all looked at each other, our faces pale in the firelight. No one spoke. Then came a sound that I will never forget. A low, wet, sniffing sound, right at the crack of the door. It was loud, inches away from us. It was the sound of a massive animal trying to scent what was inside. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just some beast wandering by. It was investigating us. Then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. We all saw it. The brass knob jiggled, then rotated a few degrees, stopping at the resistance of the lock.
My heart hammered against my ribs. Bears don't turn doorknobs. People don't come to your cabin in the middle of nowhere and try to open your door without announcing themselves. This was something else. Something intelligent. Corey was on his feet in an instant, his pistol aimed at the door. Cal grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Brian was frozen, his eyes wide with terror. The turning stopped. There was a long moment of silence. Then a low growl rumbled through the door, a sound so deep and powerful that I felt it in my chest. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a wolf. It was lower, more guttural, filled with a terrifying, resonant power. It was the sound of a predator of unimaginable size and strength. The sound was followed by a heavy thud against the door, as if a massive body had just leaned its full weight against it. The thick oak door groaned, and dust fell from the frame. We all braced for it to splinter, but it held. After that, there was only silence. We stood there for what felt like an hour, muscles locked, straining to hear anything. But there was nothing. It was gone. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the dark. The fire burned down to embers, listening. We spoke in hushed whispers, trying to process what had just happened. The intelligence of it was the most terrifying part. The testing of the knob, the deliberate, probing nature of the encounter. This wasn't a dumb animal. It was a hunter. At first light,
Bleary-eyed and on edge, we looked outside. On the porch, clear in the morning frost, were two of those same impossible tracks. They were even bigger than the ones we'd seen by the creek. And there were scratch marks on the door, deep gouges in the oak that could only have been made by massive claws. The plan was simple. Pack the essentials, get in the truck, and get the hell out of there. We moved with frantic, panicked energy, throwing our gear into bags.
The sun was up, the birds were singing again, but it was all a lie. The world felt thin, like a stage set that could be torn down at any moment to reveal the nightmare behind it. Brian was the most shaken. He was pale and trembling, his usual bravado completely shattered. He just kept muttering, "What was that? What the hell was that?" We were almost ready to go. I was doing a final sweep of the cabin when Corey, who was watching the tree line from the porch, called out in a sharp, low voice, "Alex, get over here, slowly." I moved to his side. He pointed towards the edge of the clearing about 200 yards away. "There," he whispered. I followed his gaze and my breath caught in my throat. For a fleeting moment I saw it. It was moving between two thick pines, partially obscured by shadow and branches. It was huge, far bigger than any man. It was standing on two legs, and it was covered in dark, matted fur. Its shoulders were immense, impossibly broad, and its head was canine. A long snout, pointed ears, like the head of a monstrous wolf grafted onto the body of a gorilla. It took two long, loping strides and was gone, swallowed by the forest. The glimpse lasted no more than 3 seconds, but it was burned into my mind. The proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees. The legs were bent at an angle that didn't look right, like a dog's hind legs, but it was walking upright. It was a living, breathing violation of nature. "Did you see it?" Corey asked, his voice strained. I could only nod, unable to speak. "There are two of them," he said, his gaze still fixed on the spot where it had vanished. "I saw another one moving on the ridge just before you came out." That was it. The last thread of our composure snapped. "We're leaving. Now," Cal said, his voice hard. We grabbed our bags and rushed to my truck. That's when Brian broke. He started yelling, a high, panicked sound.
"This is crazy!
It's a joke! It's gotta be a prank!" He was becoming hysterical. Corey grabbed him by the shoulders. "Brian, shut up and get in the truck. Now!" But Brian wouldn't listen. He tore away from Corey and started running towards the tree line where we'd seen the creature. "I'm gonna prove it!" he screamed. "There's nothing out there! It's some guy in a suit!" "Brian, no!" I screamed. But it was too late. He was 20 yards from the trees, a wild, terrified grin on his face, as if, by confronting the illusion, he could make it disappear. And then, the first creature stepped out of the woods. It didn't rush him. It just emerged from the shadows, unfolding to its full, terrifying height. It had to be 8, maybe 9 feet tall. It stood there, its massive form blocking the path, and looked down at Brian. The woods went completely silent again. Brian stopped dead. The grin fell from his face, replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. He made a small, choked sound. The creature was exactly as I had glimpsed it, but now it was in the open, in the full light of day, and it was worse. So much worse. The fur was a mangy, dark brown, matted with mud and something that looked like dried blood. Its chest and shoulders were a solid wall of muscle. The arms were long and sinewy, ending in huge, human-like hands with thick, black claws that looked like they could tear through steel. Its legs were digitigrade, bent backward like a dog's, but it stood on them with an unnatural ease. And the head? A massive, lupine head with a long snout full of yellow, fang-like teeth. But the eyes were the worst part. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent. They were yellow, and they glowed with a malevolent, calculating light. It took one step towards Brian. Then, from the woods to the left, the second one appeared. It was slightly smaller, but just as monstrous. They moved to flank him. They were herding him. It was a coordinated, intelligent tactic. Brian finally broke from his paralysis. He turned and ran, not back towards us, but blindly along the edge of the clearing. It was a fatal mistake. The first creature moved with a speed that was impossible for its size. It covered the distance in 3 long, loping bounds. It didn't tackle him. It reached out one of its long arms and simply swatted him out of the air like he was an insect. Brian flew a good 10 feet and hit the ground with a sickening thud. He tried to scramble up, but the creature was on him. It pinned him with one of its massive clawed hands. We heard one short, terrible scream, and then silence. The creature bent its head down. We couldn't see exactly what it was doing, but the sounds of tearing, of breaking bone, they will haunt me until the day I die. Cal was screaming Brian's name. Corey was pulling him back towards the cabin. "Get inside! Get inside!" he yelled, his voice raw with command. We scrambled back into the cabin and slammed the heavy door, throwing the deadbolt and dropping the crossbar. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely do it. We ran to the windows, peering through the small cracks in the shutters. The 2 creatures were standing over what was left of Brian. One of them looked up, its yellow eyes locking directly onto the cabin, onto the window I was looking through. It knew we were in here. It knew it had us trapped. Then, it did something that cemented the sheer alien intelligence of these things. It picked up Brian's body, slung it over its shoulder as if it weighed nothing, and walked back into the forest. The other one followed, but not before it turned and gave the cabin one last, long look, a look of promise. We were trapped. We knew they would be back. Corey took command. His military training kicked in, a small island of order in a sea of chaos. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite the horror of what we'd just witnessed. "They took the body. That means they're feeding. That gives us time. We need to fortify." We didn't have many options. The cabin was solid, but it was just wood. Cal was in shock, slumped against a wall, muttering Brian's name over and over. I was trying to fight down the panic, trying to think. "The truck," I said. "They know that's our way out." Corey nodded grimly. "They're not just animals. They're thinking. They'll disable it if they haven't already." We had to assume our only way out was on foot, and that was suicide. Our only hope was to hold out until morning, and then... what? Hope they went away? It was a flimsy hope, but it was all we had. The rest of the day was a blur of terrified waiting. Every sound from outside made us flinch. We barricaded the door with the heavy dining table. We checked the shutters again and again. Corey positioned us. He would take the front window, I would take the back, and Cal, once he'd recovered enough to hold a weapon, would be our reserve, covering the door. We had his pistol with 2 extra magazines, and my revolver with a box of 50 rounds. It felt like trying to stop a tank with a handgun. Night fell like a hammer. The silence returned, deeper and more menacing than ever. The fire was our only light, and we kept it roaring. The hours ticked by, each one an eternity. Around midnight, the attack began. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was strategic. It started with a single, loud thump on the roof, then another and another. They were on the roof, testing it. We could hear their claws scraping on the cedar shingles, heavy, dragging sounds. Then a new sound. A rhythmic thudding against the back wall of the cabin. I peered through the shutter. In the faint moonlight, I could see one of the creatures. It had found a large rock, the size of a car battery, and was methodically slamming it against the log wall right below the window. It was trying to break through. At the same time, we heard scraping at the front door. Corey looked through his peephole. "The other one's at the door," he whispered. "It's trying to pry the frame." They were coordinating. One created a loud, percussive distraction at the back, while the other worked on the primary entrance. It was a classic military tactic: isolate, probe, and breach. My mind struggled to accept what I was seeing. These were not beasts. They were soldiers. For an hour, the assault continued. The thudding at the back, the splintering sounds at the front. The log walls were thick, and they held. The door frame was splintering, but the crossbar was taking the strain. Then, the tactic shifted. The noise at the back stopped. The scraping at the front stopped. A new, more terrifying sound began. A high-pitched, wailing cry that sounded disturbingly like a woman screaming. It echoed through the valley. It was a lure. They were trying to draw us out, to make us think someone was out there, needing help. "Don't listen," Corey hissed. "It's a trick." The screaming went on for 10 minutes, a horrifying, piercing sound that frayed our nerves raw. When it stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse. We waited. Then came the crash. It was from the side of the cabin, the wall with no windows, a massive, splintering impact that shook the entire structure. They had used a battering ram, a log probably. Another crash, and another. The wall was beginning to give. Logs groaned and splintered. Then, with a final deafening crack, one of the logs burst inward, leaving a jagged hole in the wall about 3 feet off the floor. A long, clawed hand reached through the hole, blindly swiping at the air inside. It was followed by the massive, wolf-like head, its yellow eyes glowing in the firelight. It snarled, a wet, guttural sound, and snapped its jaws, trying to widen the hole. Corey didn't hesitate. He raised his pistol and fired. 3 quick shots. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was deafening inside the cabin. The creature screamed, a sound of pure agony and rage, and recoiled, pulling its head out of the hole. But the victory was short-lived. A furious bellow came from outside, and the assault on the cabin redoubled with insane fury. They were no longer being strategic. They were enraged. Thuds and crashes rained down on the walls, the door, the roof. It felt like the cabin was being torn apart around us. The front window shutter suddenly burst inward, splintered wood flying across the room. The face of the second creature appeared in the opening, its face a mask of fury, teeth bared. Cal, who had been huddled by the fire, finally broke. He screamed and charged the window, swinging the heavy iron poker. It was a brave, foolish act. The creature swiped at him through the opening. The claws caught him across the chest, and he was thrown backward like a rag doll, landing in a heap by the fireplace. He didn't move. There was so much blood. Now it was just Corey and me. The creature at the window was trying to force its massive shoulders through the frame. Corey emptied the rest of his magazine into its head and chest. The bullets hit with wet, thudding sounds. The creature roared and thrashed, but it didn't go down. It was wounded, bleeding a dark, thick fluid, but it was still coming. At the same time, the other one, the one Corey had shot first, smashed through the weakened back wall. It stumbled into the room, one arm hanging uselessly, its face a mess of blood, but it was still moving, still a threat. We were finished. 2 men against 2 wounded, furious monsters in a small enclosed space. Corey looked at me. His face was calm, terrifyingly calm. "The truck," he said. "They didn't go for the truck. They came for us. Maybe it still works." It was the slimmest of chances. "Run, Alex," he said. "Go, now!" He turned to face the creature that had just broken through the wall. He ejected his empty magazine and slammed a fresh one in with practiced, efficient motion. He didn't have to tell me twice. As Corey engaged the first creature, buying me precious seconds, I vaulted over the dining table and scrambled for the door. The second creature was still wedged in the window frame, roaring in frustration. I threw the crossbar up, my hands fumbling with the deadbolt. It finally clicked open. I wrenched the door open and ran. I didn't look back. The last thing I heard from inside the cabin was the sound of Corey's pistol firing, followed by a terrible, inhuman scream of rage, and then a final, wet, tearing sound. I ran. I ran like I have never run in my life.
I sprinted across the clearing to my truck, my lungs burning, my legs pumping on pure adrenaline. I fumbled for my keys, my fingers feeling like clumsy sausages. I ripped the driver's side door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it. I jammed the key in the ignition and twisted. The engine turned over. It actually started. The relief was so intense it was painful. I slammed the truck into reverse, not even looking, and stomped on the gas. The truck fishtailed in the dirt, the headlights cutting a wild swath across the clearing. In that brief, terrifying flash, I saw them. Both of them. They had emerged from the ruined cabin. One was dragging Corey's body by the leg. The other, the one from the window, was limping heavily, but it turned its terrible head and looked right at me. Its eyes burned with a hateful fire. I spun the wheel, throwing the truck into drive, and floored it. The tires screamed, throwing up gravel and dirt as I shot down the narrow track away from the cabin. I didn't slow down. I drove with a reckless, terrified abandon, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The two-track road was a blur. Low-hanging branches scraped and slapped against the truck. I hit ruts that sent my head slamming into the roof. I just kept my foot pressed to the floor. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw movement, a huge, dark shape, keeping pace with the truck, running through the trees alongside the road. It was impossibly fast. I pushed the old truck harder, the engine screaming in protest. For a mile, maybe two, the shape was there, a fleeting shadow in the darkness. Then, as I hit the wider, more graded section of the road, it fell back and was gone. I didn't stop until I hit the paved highway. I pulled over, my body trembling uncontrollably. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the headlights cutting into the empty darkness. I was alive. I had escaped. But Cal, Corey, and Brian were gone. I was covered in sweat and dirt, my heart hammering like it was trying to break out of my chest. I finally put the truck in gear and drove, heading for the nearest town with the sheriff's office. I stumbled into the sheriff's department in the pre-dawn light, looking like a madman. I was babbling, trying to explain what had happened. I told them about the cabin, about Brian, Cal, and Corey. I told them about the creatures. The deputy on duty, a young guy with a tired face, just looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He probably thought I was on drugs or having a psychotic break. He took my statement, but the disbelief was written all over his face. The sheriff, a man named Henderson, arrived a few hours later. He was older, weather-beaten, and had a calm, professional demeanor that was somehow more infuriating than open disbelief. I told him the whole story again. I described the tracks, the intelligence, the attack. I told him about the creatures, their appearance, their coordinated assault. I begged him to send a team up there to look for my friends. He listened patiently, nodding in all the right places. When I was done, he sighed. "Son," he said, his voice gentle, "you've been through a major trauma. It's not uncommon for the mind to play tricks on you in a situation like that. He told me they would send a team up to the cabin as soon as the weather was clear. He asked me if we had been drinking. I said yes, the first night. He made a note. He asked if there might have been any hallucinogens, maybe some mushrooms Brian brought from the city. I told him no, absolutely not. He just nodded again. They kept me there for most of the day. A doctor checked me over, noted my exhaustion and agitated state. The official investigation began, but it was clear from the start what conclusion they were heading for. 2 days later, Sheriff Henderson came to see me again. His face was grim.
He told me they'd found the cabin. It had been, in his words, torn apart by a bear. A large one, he said. A grizzly. He said they found blood evidence that matched Cal's and Corey's. They found Brian's jacket torn to shreds about a half-mile into the woods. "What about the tracks?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "What about the door? The hole in the wall?" He had an answer for everything. The tracks were inconclusive, probably a deformed bear or a combination of overlapping prints. The damage to the cabin was consistent with a desperate, enraged grizzly. He said it was a tragic but not unheard of incident, a bear attack. My friends were listed as deceased, victims of a wild animal. My story, my testimony of what actually happened, was dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized mind, colored by alcohol and fear. The case was closed. I was released. I went back to my life, or what was left of it. But the official report was a lie. I knew what I saw. I had to go back. A week later, against everyone's advice, I drove back up that gravel road. The authorities had put up a gate with a sign warning of aggressive bear activity, but they hadn't locked it. I drove to the cabin. It was taped off, but I went in anyway. The place was a wreck, just as they'd said. But I wasn't looking at the damage. I was looking for proof. I found one. Tucked deep into a crack in the floorboards near the broken window was a single, coarse, dark hair. It was thicker than any bear hair I had ever seen, and wedged into the splintered doorframe was a piece of a claw, a black, curved shard about an inch long. I took them. They were all I had. As I was leaving the cabin, a county sheriff's vehicle pulled up. It was an older deputy, a man I hadn't seen before. His name was Miller. He got out of his car and walked towards me, not with anger, but with a kind of weary resignation. He told me I shouldn't be there. I started to argue, to tell him the official story was wrong. He just held up a hand. He looked at the ruined cabin, then back at me. "I've been working this county for 35 years, he said, his voice low. "Your friends aren't the first. Every 5 or 10 years, someone goes missing up in these mountains. A hunter, a hiker. The official report is always the same. Bear attack, lost to the elements." He looked me dead in the eye. "But the stories the old-timers tell, the ones you hear in the bars late at night, they're different." He didn't say he believed me. He didn't have to. He just told me that some places in the woods are older and deeper than we think, and they have teeth. He advised me to take my evidence, if I had any, and go home. He told me to never, ever come back to this mountain. Then he got in his car and drove away, leaving me standing there with the truth, a piece of claw, and a single, impossible hair. I had the hair and claw fragment analyzed by a private lab, paying cash and claiming they were from an undocumented species I was researching. The results were useless. The hair had mitochondrial DNA that was broadly canine, but with markers that didn't match any known species. The claw fragment was keratin, like any claw or fingernail,
but its density was off the charts, almost like a mineral. It was biological, but it was wrong. It was proof that proved nothing. That was 5 years ago. I don't work in the woods anymore. I sold my surveying equipment. I can't even stand to be in a forest. The peace I once found there is gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. The sound of wind in the pines sounds like breathing. The snap of a twig sounds like a footstep. I live in the city now. I have nightmares every night. I see those yellow eyes, that impossible loping run. I hear the sounds of the attack, the screams of my friends.
I live with the guilt of being the one who ran, the one who survived.
Cal and I don't talk anymore. The few times we tried, the subject of that weekend was a wall between us. He wants to forget. I can't. I know what's out there. They are smart, they are strong, and they are real. The world is not the safe, understood place we think it is. We live on a well-lit island, and we pretend the vast, dark ocean around us isn't teeming with monsters. But it is. I am telling you this because the official story is a comfortable lie designed to keep the world orderly. But the truth is messy, and it is terrifying. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods and the forest goes silent, don't try to rationalize it. Don't wait for proof. Just get out. Run. Because you are being hunted, and you are no longer at the top of the food chain. My name is Alex Thompson, and I am a survivor. But some part of me died up on that mountain with my friends in the ruins of that cabin.